Live from Gotham City, it's the BatPodcast. I'm your host, Bat the Batman fan, and I am very excited to welcome you to the first episode of the show. It's going to be a lot of fun. Every month I'm going to be interviewing all sorts of interesting people from the Batman universe, and some people you might not even expect. I'm also going to be giving away a lot of cool prizes, both here on the podcast and on the Facebook page, so make sure you like me on Facebook. Before we go any further, I want to point out that the music that you're hearing is by a tremendous duo from the UK called White Wall, and I'm very pleased that they let us use this track for the show. It is called The Guardian. Very appropriate for a Batman podcast, I would say. Couldn't be happier to have it as a theme song. Download yourself a copy. It is great for playing in the car, driving around at night, pretending that you're in the Batmobile. We've all done it. Nothing to be ashamed of. If it is, well, then that's just too bad, I guess. Because I'm not ashamed. Real quick, on a personal note, before we get started, I do want to say my dad, who we lost a few years ago, always told me to find something that I really wanted to do with my life and stick to it. So, since there's nothing I like better in the world than talking about Batman, that's what I'm sticking to. So, thanks, Dad. I also want to thank my mom, who is thankfully still with us. She sewed me my very first Batman costume when I was but a wee lad of 4 years old. She's thrown me a lot of Batman-themed birthday parties over the years, and she still supports my Batmania to this day. Thanks, Mom. Okay, that concludes the sentimental portion of the show. Now down to business. My first guest is an accomplished voiceover actor. He is the announcer for The Tonight Show for exactly 4 more days until Jay Leno retires. That looks good on the old resume. He's also a regular on Family Guy. That's also a pretty darn good gig. Most importantly for us here on the show today, he is the voice of Edward Nygma, a.k.a. the Riddler, in the Arkham game series. In fact, he's the only voice actor to return to play the same major character in all 3 games. Not too shabby. He's also been a personal friend of Adam West's for over 30 years, and he will dazzle and astound you with his knowledge of the 1966 Batman television series, especially the costumes, as you'll hear on the show today. I was happy to interview him at his home and personal Shangri-La, which he has dubbed Planet Wallywood. So without further ado, let me introduce my guest, the very interesting and very talented Mr. Wally Wingert, and let him explain to you exactly what Planet Wallywood is.
Well, Planet Wallywood is like Planet Hollywood. I took the name a while back when I decided that going to a place where you can eat and have food and hang out and watch movies and be surrounded by all the TV and movie collectibles and artwork and stuff, it'd be kind of a cool thing. But so Planet Wallywood is actually a twist on Planet Hollywood, the old thing that's, I think, Stallone and Schwarzenegger put together. So I've amassed a modest collection of stuff over the years, of things that I enjoy, things that I look at and makes me happy, and I basically don't have a square foot of space on the wall or on the floor left for anything else. It's much like a museum. When you walk in, there's something for you to see. I've got friends that have been coming here for years, and they'll come over and look at something and go, "Oh, that's new." I'm like, "No, it's been here for 10 years." It's like, wow, how did I miss that? It's good to have a 12-year-old's heart with a 50-year-old's money.
Amen.
And see, nice. Collect all this. And I've collected up some other stuff from films and TV shows over the years, and autographs and celebrities that I've had the occasion to meet, and have been real lucky in running into a lot of them and actually working with a few of them. And it's like, "Hey, would you sign this?" "Okay, sure, whatever." My childhood hero, Paul Michael Glaser, doesn't really get the whole fan thing. I'm like, yeah, some people do drugs, collect autographs. So what? Keeps me off the streets.
Exactly. I love the young at heart mentality. No one knows how long they're going to be here. Have a good time while you're here.
Yep. That's what it's all about.
Right.
Yep.
I don't even think if we took all the time on the podcast today, we could even cover a third of what's in
here. Yeah, the problem with the video tour on WallyOnTheWeb.com is that stuff changes so much around here, and I move stuff around so often that by the time I get a video up, and it's been up for like a month, it's already outdated. So the Chaney room is like all different. It's a room that I dedicate to the work of Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces from the old silent film era. Because it was a working makeup room in my house for a while there. And now it's mostly just a display room with a bunch of wax museum quality collector figures of Laurel and Hardy and James Bond and Michael Myers and the Scarecrow from Romney Marsh and Jonathan Frid. But out here in the main area, I have the thing that you and I first met over, the Adam West and Burt Ward Batman and Robin.
That's right. The Burt Ward is new since I was last here.
Yes.
It's looking fantastic.
Thanks.
Now, those costumes on them, would those be exact replicas, Wally?
They are exact replicas. A while back, I got to meet a guy named Mark Hardiman, who was lucky enough in the late 80s to find a set of Batman and Robin original costumes for pennies on the dollar.
Nice.
And he bought them, and he's had them ever since. And he wanted to get them authenticated in the early 2000s and said, well, let's see what this internet thing has to say. And my name kept coming up because I had been a friend of Jan Kemp's, who was the costume designer for the Batman TV series in 1966 through 68. And he wanted to get a hold of Mr. Kemp, who had passed away by then. And I said, well, he's passed away, but I know all the stuff to look for, so if you want to bring him over, I'll look him over and I can tell you exactly, what you're looking at, because I knew all the types of fabrics, and I had seen plenty of fakes. Not necessarily fakes that were trying to be pushed off as original costumes, but costumes that were fan-made for people to dress up. And I was making my own Batman costume back in about 1980, when I first met Adam West, so I was one of the original, probably the original cosplayer, the Batman 66 cosplayer. Nobody was interested in Batman 66 in 1980.
Sure.
But I was, since I was 5 years old, and I met Adam West at a car show as a radio DJ. He came to my town, and he was in his Batman costume. I was looking it over very carefully. So I said, I'd like to make one of those, because I always wanted one of those. So I put together a very crude, Batman costume, and I would go out to shopping malls. The next year that World of Wheels came back, Adam wasn't there, but one of the fiberglass Batmobiles were there. So I went down in my Batman costume, and people freaked out and said, we got to get a picture of you next to this. So people were taking photos, and I thought, this is pretty fun, actually. So I really had a good time. So yes, I'm probably the original Batman 66 cosplayer. And stopped doing it like mid-2000s because they just let the other kids play for a while.
Right.
But it got me really keenly interested in how those costumes were made. So when I met Jan Kemp, the creator of the Batman costumes for the show, at a screening of the 1966 film in 1989, as Warner was showing their new Michael Keaton Tim Burton film in Westwood, an oldie station here in town was showing a re-premiere of the 1966 Batman film at another theater, and I said, I'd rather go to that. And Burgess Meredith was there, Cesar Romero was there, Frank Gorshin, Yvonne Craig,
Wow.
Lee Merriweather, Stanley Ralph Ross,
Oh my goodness.
Burt Ward, everybody but Adam, basically. And I'm standing around having a soda and talking to the guy and said, wow, this is really something. This is a dream come true. He says, yes, this is very nice. Not elderly in the elderly sense, but
Right.
probably 60s, something like that. I said, did you work on the film? Figuring he was the director or something. I didn't know if he was Leslie Martinson or what.
Right.
He says, no, I'm Jan Kemp. I created the costumes. And I immediately fell to my knees and I started going,
Nice.
I said, I wanted to meet you ever since I was 5 years old. How did you make that cowl? Because it was perplexing me.
Right.
And I could not figure it out. He says, oh, it's easy. It was a fiberglass shell. We put some stretch satin over it, put some discs and some thing, and made some ears. And I said, well, how did you sew in the thing on the front, the black part? He says, oh, it wasn't sewed in. It was just painted. I was like, oh, my God. It was like one of those revelations that you've always looked forward to all your life to have as a kid. And it all started coming clear. And I said, I will pay you money to sit down with me and record on a recorder on cassette tape all the questions that I have. He says, oh, okay. I said, I want to make one of those suits. I've always wanted a really, really deluxe one, and to get all the information about how they were really made would be really great. So he turned over all of his notes to me that he had. He still had his notes from back then, who he had the boots made from, the gloves made from, where he got the tights, where he had them dyed, where he got the cape, where he got the fabric, where he got the stretch satin, where he got the da-da-da-da-da.
Wow.
So, unfortunately, from 66 to 89, 23 years had passed, a lot of those places had gone out of business.
Sure.
But there was a few places. A guy named Safwat down at International Silks and Woolens was still there, and he remembered Jan Kemp very well, and said, oh yeah, we've got some of that fabric still in the back. So I bought several yards of the original jumbo, what's called jumbo spandex, which had a very specific type of feel. So when Mark Hardiman called, I said, I'll know by feeling the fabric if it's the original stuff or not. Because on the back, it had a real rough kind of texture, but on the surface, it was real smooth, it was heavy fabric, and it was stretch, and it was satin. It only came in 2 colors back in '66, black and white, and of course they would dye it to the blue that they needed it to be, to match the cape and everything else. But it wouldn't hold the dye very well. Something about the acetate, Jan said, in that fabric would not hold the dye. So it wouldn't. The dye wouldn't actually dye the fibers. It would just kind of coat it. So after a period of time, after exposure to lights and heat and whatever, it would start to kind of turn purplish.
Sure.
And eventually turned kind of a berry color. Now, when Mark Hardiman walked in with his costume and everything had turned berry, I was like, it's the right stuff.
Wow.
And it had the rough kind of back that it needed. I found out years later what that fabric was actually made for and why you were unable to find it very, very easily in the 80s, 90s, 2000s was it was originally girdle material. You know, women in the 50s, 60s would wear girdles. And in the 70s, that kind of went out the door. Nobody really wore girdles anymore. And by the 80s, it was right out.
Right.
So that fabric just wasn't really needed anymore. So you could find it in a couple of vintage shops, and people have looked around and found bolts and bolts and bolts of it, and then they run out of it and whatever. But another guy that I know by the name of Chuck Williams has done exhaustive research on all of this, and has actually, I think, figured out a way to dye the fabric and actually have the fabric dyed for good.
Oh.
So it actually dyes the fibers, and it doesn't just coat it with the color. He's done exhaustive research on it, and he's done some really amazing work. So the work that I did early on was just a stepping stone to the other guys who really locked into it later and said, I really want to figure out how this is made. Now, guys have taken patterns off of the Mark Hardiman costumes, which is where those come from. So when Mark brought the costume over, and I was convinced immediately that it was authentic, I called my seamstress and said, you've got to get over here right now, bring some paper, bring your camera and some measuring tape, and get over here right now.
Right.
So he let us strike patterns from everything, and if we were missing anything by the time he lives in San Francisco, by the time he went back, if there was anything I needed, I would just email him, and he'd take measurements and photos, and so all of that stuff is right off the patterns.
Wow.
So yeah, it's pretty cool to finally, after all these years, see that TV Guide picture over there of Adam on the cover of TV Guide.
Yeah.
I think when we first started watching Batman, it was on a black and white TV when I was a kid.
Wow.
But that was my first exposure to Batman in color. I was in the bathroom at my Grandma Hewitt's house, and she had that TV Guide in there, and I was looking at the cover, and I could not take my eyes off it. That cowl I was like, how do they, it's so shiny and it's so amazing. And I could not take my eyes off it, and I've loved that picture ever since I was a kid. And that was, when I met Jan, I said, how did you make that cowl? Because then the shot of that TV Guide cover from when I was 5 or 6 came rushing back into my mind. And I said, I've got to know all the secrets, how that was made. So there's a lot of tricks to those costumes, a lot of little things that people don't realize.
I'll bet.
That most fans, when they make their costumes, well, now the patterns are out there. But before they were released, a lot of fans didn't really have an idea that it was there, including myself, about how the cape was not stitched at the bottom and then turned inside out. It was overlocked. So it wasn't that bulky seam at the bottom. It was actually flat. And how the cape points on the edge curve out and scoop out as opposed to just being flat.
Right.
And I'm disappointed now that TV series toys are coming out, Hot Toys, NECA, Mattel, that they didn't get those right.
Oh,
they didn't get those little nuances. And every other little detail was correct, except they didn't get the capes right.
Note to NECA and everybody,
do your
hire
homework.
Wally.
Do your homework.
Man.
Or hire Chuck Williams or somebody who knows what it's all about, because I have the NECA standing in my display case, and I have the cape folded back twice like it was on the show, and it falls essentially the same way, because if you take the cape off and look at it, it is made very similar to the TV show cape, because it wraps all the way around and closes in the front. It meets in the front. But it's missing those little scoops, which I think gives it so much more personality.
Right.
So when I met Adam initially, I studied his costume, but then in 1995 we put together another costume for him for a photo shoot that he was doing. He didn't want to use his originals because they were aged.
Right.
But he brought his original cape and his original boots and stuff, and we took patterns off of that at Universal Studios when I was working up there as Beetlejuice. I had him meet us there, and then we struck patterns on the spot. And I was looking at the cape going, oh my gosh, it curves out. And then I started looking at photos going, yeah, there's a little tiny point that shoots out there on the side. It's great. So it's all those little idiosyncrasies, those little nuances of those costumes that when you get them right, they're right. But when you cut corners, it's like, it's not quite there,
right.
Yeah. It's just amazing. Before the 66 film came out on Blu-ray, everybody still thought that Batman's nose lines and his eyebrows were white, because all the prints that you were seeing on TV were so aged that it was faded and it just looked white.
Right.
It was light blue. And now you see it on the Blu-ray when it's crystal clear, and you're like, oh yeah, it's blue. And I knew they were blue because I'd seen Adam's cowl that he had at the car show, and I always knew they were light blue. But it's tough when in 1980 when you're trying to remember something that you had seen a guy wear, and you're sketching stuff out, and you're like, I think it went like this, and I just remembered seeing some black, and I thought, well, I want to take. So the only thing I could find was a scuba hood. Like one of those neoprene scuba hoods at like a local store. And I bought one and I cut it to where I thought it was, and then I stitched in a Halloween mask face in the front that I'd covered in vinyl, and it was pretty crude, but it seemed to work pretty well at the time. But the only photo references I had were the stupid Viewmasters. There were no photo stores in South Dakota, there was no internet, there was no magazines, there's nothing that you could find these photos anywhere except the Viewmaster, which you could still get in the store. You could still go and buy the Batman Viewmaster.
Right.
So here I am, holding up this Viewmaster to the light, trying to see what it is, trying to make a sketch of how I wanted to do it, and it was very, very difficult to try and get any sort of idea about what those costumes were all about. But Jan had all kinds of great reasons for everything that he had done. First of all, the costumes that he did for that show were a virtual, literal translation of what he was seeing on the page. So, because comic books are full of color, in the old days, they wanted it colorful as possible. So, Batman was originally supposed to be black and gray, but the highlights were blue.
Right.
Yeah, and it just started to be more blue than black after a while, and it started looking kind of cool blue and gray. And now we think of Batman, old school Batman, as blue and gray.
Right.
And because the shadowing but finding that satin fabric was Jan's literal translation of, well, what's dark when it doesn't have light, and what's blue when it does have light? Well, satin.
Right.
So that's why they use the shot silk for the cape with that satiny texture. That's why they use the stretch satin in blue. So it had a really nice, kind of sheen to it. But Batman's face area around the eyes and the eyebrows and around the nose was always in the comics black, because you'd think that the light was coming out from somewhere else, so his face was almost kind of shaded. Jan painted that area of the cowl so it would be a literal translation of that famous Batman with the black. And it's so funny how this stuff gets started. And then, of course, the ears were shaded and had dimension in the comics, so he painted the ears as well. So they had to cast Adam's head initially, and then sculpt on a form for this cowl shell. And they sculpted it out of probably clay, and then cast it, and then made a fiberglass shell. They stretched this satin over it. In order to get it to lay around the shoulders and around his neck, they made a pie cut and had some snaps back there so the cowl could snap onto the cape so it wouldn't move around. And at first they started with these little fiberglass discs that they would put in these fabric ear forms, and they would staple it right to the side of the cowl. And so the early cowls, you can see a staple underneath the fabric. You can see that little kind of bump.
Oh.
Yeah, that's the staple that goes into the cowl. Later they just decided to ditch the staple altogether, just make them out of stiff fabric and just kind of stitch them to the thing so you didn't see the staple, so the ears were smoother.
Right.
And sometimes he would paint the ears all the way down. Sometimes he would just paint the actual ear. There were snaps underneath the neck that kept it on. And you never saw Batman on the show taking off the cowl. He was either Bruce Wayne or he was either Batman. He was never half in, half out.
Right.
So when I saw Adam backstage at the World of Wheels remove his cowl, I almost wet myself. It was like, I've never seen that before. You never saw in the show Batman going and taking off the cowl, and it was magical, and I'll never forget it. Then the leotard and the tights were just basic Capezio dancewear that you'd go down to Hollywood. You would just buy them off the rack, the turtleneck leotard and the tights, and you just dye them have a place that dyes stuff for studios. And the trunks were made out of the same fabric that was stretched over the cowl. The gloves were made by Hammer Gloves on Melrose in Hollywood. The gal who owns Hammer Gloves now, her name is Dorothy Gaspar. It's now called Gloves by Gaspar. She bought the company from Mr. and Mrs. Hammer when she was working with them as a young girl as an intern. She still has the original patterns that they drew up for Adam West's Batman gloves that are drawn on a page of the Los Angeles Times.
Wow.
And it says in print, like a pencil or something, Adam West 1965. 1965.
Wow.
That's the giveaway that they're real because the show was in production in 65.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. They just traced his hand on a piece of newspaper.
Wow.
And said this will be the glove pattern, and she still has them to this day.
Does she have it like up on the wall there? Or something?
No. So maybe I'm not sure, but she's got them. I would like to actually have them.
I can see that.
Yeah, I would like to actually have those. Yeah, just to say this is the original. I would frame it. It's like, what is this piece of newspaper up there? And the cape was in 4 pieces with the seam running down the center, and there was this. From the seam down the center to the shoulder, it was cut, and then another piece exactly the same but flipped, going this way. Of course, it had that little scoop cut into it, and then you just duplicate it for the other side, stitch it all together, and it was 4 pieces: right shoulder, left shoulder, right front chest, left front chest, and it was all stitched together. And there were things there that would keep it in place, and snaps on the shoulders to also keep it snapped onto the leotard. The cape was then folded back and snapped into place on the back and then folded forward. Jan said the reason he did that was to build up Adam's shoulders, to look more shouldery, to look buffer. Occasionally on the show you'd see a little line when Batman would turn his back to the camera. You'd see a line going from one section of the cape to the other section of the cape, and I never understood what that was. And I said, well, what is that? Is it something in the fabric? He says, no, it was fish line. They would take little gold safety pins and put it on one side of the cape and one side of the cape so it wouldn't fall forward. So if Adam bent down, it wouldn't fall into what he was doing. So I was like, fish line, interesting. So that was the genius of Jan Kemp.
Well, we are getting an education here.
Yeah, no, I love talking about Jan Kemp. He was quite the guy.
Well, that's one of the things I've always liked about you, Wally, is your attention to these sort of little things that might just be lost to time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just incredible.
Yeah, no, I was very lucky to have run into him.
Now, speaking of Adam, you said you met him when you were working as a radio DJ.
Yes.
And that led to pretty much a lifelong friendship.
Yeah, I've known him for 30 some odd years now, and we work together on Family Guy, and it's all kind of a happy ending.
That's cool. And you wrote a song, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. Well, when I first met Adam, we stayed in contact, and he said, I think I might, have something I want to run by you in your radio audience. And there was talk about, in the mid-'80s, about another Batman movie. Mm-hmm. And this was about 86, and I think there was just real basic talk about it. Nobody knew what it was going to be, but everybody was talking about Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns. Right. So they were talking about a 60-year-old Batman. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, it's got to be Adam West, because he's the guy. So we had parties and functions and petition drives to get Adam West as Batman in this movie that we thought was basically going to be The Dark Knight Returns. Mm-hmm. And then we found out later that it was going to completely reinvent Batman from his absolute beginning. And we're like, oh, man, really? Oh, this is... Because I had just run into Adam, and he was in really good shape still, and he could still really be Batman. Mm-hmm. Right around 89, when we figured that Adam was not going to be included in any way in this movie, I was like, really the only way I knew how to express myself was through humor. And in 1989, a song came out called Wild Wild West by the Escape Club. And I had, at that point, probably 6 or 7 of my parody songs played on the Dr. Demento show, which was a nationwide, international...
I remember Dr. Demento well.
If you consider American Armed Forces Radio and some of the other things, it was international. So I said, I'm going to try and... This is going to be my project now. I want to really voice my displeasure for this.
He's beating up the Joker, the Riddler, and the others, but now his greatest foes are the folks that Brothers?
Will their big budget blockbuster be a Bat Bomb? Will Bat fans care that Batman is also Mr. Mom? Tune in tomorrow to learn the rest.
'Cause I'll be watching Batman starring Adam West. Adam West.
And then they said, of all the strange things, they said it was going to be Michael Keaton.
Right.
And I was like, what? Oh my gosh.
You're along with everybody else.
Yeah, and I was like, I don't get that one at all. He's a funny guy, and I loved him in Mr. Mom and Beetlejuice, but what?
Oh, yeah, right.
And then I realized that Tim Burton had such a weird, skewed version of what my superhero was all about. I'm like, this is not for me.
Right.
This is just not going to be for me. So I said, okay, well, let's take some digs. So I wrote this song and produced it up with some friends of mine playing guitar and different things and engineering and doing things, and sent it to Demento, and he played it, and it started getting requests, and he played it. It ended up being, I think, the number 2 most requested song of the entire year. It came in at on the Funny 25 at the end of the year as being the number 2 song.
Well done.
So thank you. And it was mentioned in Rolling Stone, and Adam would talk about it every time he was interviewed. Adam, what do you think about the new? Well, there's people out there who are writing songs in protest. Wally Wingert wrote a song. And they go, wow, okay. So they'd come in, and we had printed records, like little 45s and everything, and so it was pretty cool. Even Tim Burton's management had called to try and get a copy.
That's funny.
Because I think they wanted to see exactly what the song... But it was all in humor.
Yeah.
It wasn't too mean-spirited.
Yeah.
And the movie came out, I'm like, all right, this isn't for me. This is... Black Rubber Batman is just not my thing. So it was like, okay, well, it's probably all over. But because of the interest in that new movie, then there was a new interest in the 66 as well. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of reinvigorating to see some of these old Batman TV episodes that we had seen on like an old UHF channel back in Sioux Falls on crappy old videotape. Now it was, the prints were looking pretty good. They had all been remastered, and it's like, I've never seen it this clear before. This is really beautiful. So the colors that Jan used in those costumes were just amazing. He would put colors with other colors that should not belong.
Right.
But because it was one of the first TV series in color on national television, he's like, let's have fun, let's go for it, So there was purple and green and pink and, blue and all this stuff smashed together, and it was just like, oh my gosh, my eyes. It was the 60s, and it was all, the gloves were off. It's like, that's the 60s, man.
We're just going to ride it as far as we can.
Yeah.
That's
so it was a being unto its own time element, because it just was a product of its time.
What did I tell you, folks? The man knows his 1966 Batman. Well, that's part 1 of my interview with Wally Wingert. Tune in tomorrow for part 2. We're going to talk about him playing the Riddler in the Arkham game series. And we're also going to play Riddle Me This. That's our monthly contest, and we're going to be giving away a deluxe Arkham City Riddler figure autographed by Wally. I should also mention that you can download a free copy of Wally's parody song Adam West on his website. Isn't that nice of him? WallyOnTheWeb.com. That's Wally's website. I highly recommend it. You can take an online tour of Planet Wallywood from there and see all of Wally's amazing adventures and his collection of goodies, including the life-size replicas of Adam West and Burt Ward, complete with their 100% authentic costumes. You can be sure of that. Also, I'd like to point out that in that display behind Adam and Bert, you'll see a replica of the aquatic bat sprays that they used in the Adam West film. Those were made by yours truly. I had made them after watching the movie one day and thinking that would be a fun prop to make, and so I made them with the help of my dad. Thanks again, Dad. And they were great. They looked really good, but I didn't quite have room in my collection. They didn't quite fit in with my collection, so I offered to loan them to display at Planet Wallywood for Wally, because it went much better with his display of vintage Batman stuff. So anyway, a little shameless plug for my own handiwork there. I also want to mention a really great website for info on the 1966 Batman television series, 66batman.com. Great forum, a lot of friendly people. You'll get everything and more that you wanted to know about the television series. And a lot of the info there, you can bet, was contributed by Wally. It's an excellent website, 66batman.com. I'm Pat the Batman Fan. Tune in tomorrow for part 2 of my interview with Wally. Same bat time, same bat podcast, as it were, live from Gotham City.